My friends, it might seem unbelievable, but it's finally happening. This colossal project is coming to its end. We have everything ready to make a decently sized diorama. A barn made from styrofoam, a T29 tank from Takom in 1/35 scale, and 3 resin figures from Alpine. Now we have to somehow put everything on this block of styrofoam and create a fitting landscape. I started with a rather simple task, texturing the foam with a steel wire brush so it will provide more grip for the terrain. And because destroying foam is satisfying, I also made a few terrain features with a hobby knife. This time I didn't want to leave the sides exposed, although the foam is very smooth, but it's also very fragile and can be easily damaged. So I decided to go old school and laminate them with balsa planks. However, these will start warping due to the moisture and as such need to be held in place while the glue is setting. The quickest, most ghetto solution I could think of is pinning it. 10-inch nails would probably be too much, but corkboard pins are excellent for the job. The thicker they are, the better they'll grip. I waited for about an hour before removing them. By this time the glue was fully dry and thus I could clean the whole thing up. Carving the excess, sanding it, filling holes with wood putty, and sanding once again. Now we have a neat and clean base, which is important in every diorama. I'm leaving a small protrusion around the whole thing so that I could carve it flush with the terrain. Now we can glue the barn in place with PVA glue. It's important to do it early in my opinion because the back wall must sit flush with the base. As we say here, measure twice, cut once. Some extra filling was needed here because there was a small gap, but nothing that couldn't be fixed in a few minutes. Let's now make some preparations for the groundwork. I made a few terrain features with air drying clay, but just a few mounts and ruts, not the entire base like in my previous attempts. It's just there to give the terrain some more variation. Now I could remove the excess wood and cut it flush with the base, including all the terrain undulations. This way we'll be able to cover the edges with dirt, and thus avoiding that framed, so to say, look, which kinda subtracts from the authenticity of the scene. Moving on, I decided to go full DIY with the groundwork and made my own acrylic mud paste. The recipe is simple: PVA glue, sand, and real earth from my garden. Mix all of these ingredients together, and if the paste is too thick, add water if needed. It should have enough viscosity so we can still call it a paste, not a sludge or, I don't know, jelly or milk. Working with this concoction is quite simple. We spread it over the foam in a reasonably thick layer, which means not a thin crust to a point where you can see the styrofoam, and not a thick mud cake because it would take forever to dry and chances are it might crack while drying. I also found it best to work in small sections at a time, but spreading it with something like a spatula might speed up the whole process. While it's still wet, we sprinkle the dry ingredients all over it. They'll add realistic texture, but they'll also speed up the drying process, especially the dirt, which will soak up water from the paste. We'll leave it like this for about half an hour until it starts to solidify, and then we can add any imprints we desire. Track marks from the main protagonist of this anime are the most important, and I was very lucky to have a spare section of real model tracks which are the same type like on the T29. If you're not patient and the clay mixture is still soft, you'll end up tearing it out, in which case you'll have to patch the hole up and wait until it's hard enough. Adding other track marks will make the groundwork more busy, as if tanks were regularly traveling through this area. DS tracks from Dragon are excellent for this. In fact, this is probably the only thing they're good for, but hey, at least we found something good about them. And let's not forget figure boot prints, especially G.I. Joe so he doesn't levitate above the ground. The barn needed something which would integrate it with the scene, so to say, and I think pavement stones might be simple yet effective enough. I made them by tearing random chunks from a thin strip of styrofoam, which creates very nice shapes, and these were then textured with a toothbrush. Yeah, it's one of those shower thought techniques which you try and you're like, oh, that actually worked. So, I mean, at least to some extent. Okay, I'm not trying to pretend those are perfect or anything. Moving on, I sprinkled several sizes of rocks and gravel over the entire surface, focusing them mostly into corners and around the road. This was followed up by various lengths of dried up seagrass, which will form that, lower level of vegetation. Everything was flooded with diluted PVA glue, which will not only fix all these random bits to the ground, but also seal and encase the groundwork itself, so there will be no chunks of dirt flying off as we continue. With this step out of the way, let's add some features and vegetation. I'm not too nitpicky when it comes to small details, so I was more than happy with a tree trunk made from a dried up plant root, MG34 ammo canisters laying on the ground to sort of set the scene, because this after all is a what if diorama taking place somewhere in Germany 1946 or so. And also a bunch of civilian stuff like a bucket from mini art, wooden crates which are a mixture of mini art and 3D printing, and a fuel drum from Panzer art. Now it's time for the true diorama moment, adding static grass, and the correct way to do it is to toss a few packs on the base and put a static grass applicator on top of it. Or, a more time-consuming approach is to stipple PVA glue in random shapes and amounts on the ground, and then sprinkle the grass through the applicator. Then you give it a few smacks and the excess grass falls off, leaving you with a pretty authentic looking tufts. I like to work in small sections because then I'm not rushed by the drying PVA glue, and instead of covering a large surface I prefer smaller, random spots which I might then connect into larger ones if needed. It's also a nice way to keep grass at bay, so all of a sudden you won't be like, uh-oh, I did too much grass. Yeah, to get a more natural look, it's not a bad idea to combine different lengths. The first layer was about 3mm, I think, and this one is roughly 7mm tall. Longer grass has a harder time falling through the mesh on the applicator, so you might need to spend more time applying it until you achieve full coverage. It also has more problems standing straight up, in which case we can help it with a large soft paintbrush. The final layer consists of long tufts of grass which are about 1 centimeter tall. I honestly can't tell because there are no labels on the packs and I'm too lazy to measure it. But this one is almost impossible to apply properly, so I find it better to grab a large chunk with a pair of tweezers, dip it into undiluted PVA glue and stick it into the ground. Tufts like these tend to look more random, which is not a bad thing at all. And of course, if you really love your diorama, you should spoil it with some golden bling. But don't spoil it too much, because photo etch plants are expensive. Like for example, one small set can cost up to 10 euros, which is, on one hand it's ridiculous, but on the other, I think it's quite reasonable. Twigs from dried up seafoam are a much more budget-oriented option, but they don't look as realistic as photo etch or laser cut plants. But still, they're definitely nice. Before we start painting though, let's not forget to seal the sides with diluted PVA glue. Balsa wood is very hairy and PVA will nicely glue all the fuzz together. With this out of the way, our diorama is ready for painting. But why would you do that, you might say? I know, the ground looks pretty okay as it is. It's brown and the grass is green. What more would you ask for? But trust me, it's gonna look just a tiny bit better once it's painted. First off, we're gonna unify everything with a solid coat of primer. I'd prefer a black one, but I already spent an entire bottle in 5 months. That's how much I like it. But dark brown is gonna be good enough. It's still gonna provide us with that nice, deep shadow in the grass. It would be a real shame if I accidentally primed the finished barn, wouldn't it? But a high-tech paper mask solved this problem, which probably didn't even exist in the first place. And that, my friends, is how you ruin an entire diorama. So, let's continue, shall we? As I learned on the Yak Tiger vignette, it's easier to start by spraying vegetation because there's gonna be a lot of overspray. I wasn't sure about the time of the year, it's a what-if scene after all, and I'm not overly bothered with some elaborate backstory for it, so I started with a dark yellow coat to make the grass look dry. I also made a few highlights by adding white into the dark yellow, just to make the grass look more three-dimensional, so to say, because, if it has shadows created with a dark primer, it also deserves a few highlights here and there. Then I mixed a very bright, happy green tone from natto green and yellow green. When you're painting grass, it's better to work with lighter tones, because when you think about the physics of all of that, it's just a large pile of very thin stalks which don't reflect too much light, and as such we need to paint it lighter. I know it sounds like it doesn't make any sense, but trust me, it does. Spraying it like this gives you plenty of color variation, just like in real life. And because we have a mixture of yellow and green grass, I'd say the scene is situated in the early spring or late autumn. Now we can paint the ground, which will tidy up all those yellow and green oversprays, but also give the dirt a more accurate color, which will match the mud tones on the tank. Back in the day, I'd go with this light layer and add the remaining effects with enamel paints, but because I knew the ground would be muddy, I tried adding more variation. So I mixed a darker tone, which I mainly sprayed on the tank tracks, which is where most mud will be concentrated. This on its own would be quite boring, wouldn't it? And that would mean more work with brushes and enamels, so I quickly sprayed a few highlights with the first color, giving it more contrast and definition. When the ground was unpainted, it was almost impossible to see those track marks, and now, all thanks to paints, they're clearly defined. The airbrushing stage is now finished, which mostly means no more masking on the barn, but also the grass is more subtle and it has more color variation, and the ground is more defined and matches the mud on the tank a bit better. Let's now paint everything that was too small for the airbrush. Small stones are a great pastime activity when you're bored. These are painted with different Vallejo acrylics such as Deck Tan, Light Mud, Brown Sand, Old Wood, Neutral Grey and Iraqi Sand. Painting such a large amount of details might seem daunting at first, but it's totally worth it. Just put on a podcast or a playlist and in about 2 hours you'll have a lot of visual texture on your base. Small stones are one thing, but how about big ones? This is where wet blending enters the chat. I started with a mixture of grey and old wood for the base coat. Then a heavy wash from light mud. Followed with another wash with burnt umber. Then again some light mud here and there as a sort of highlight. Then pure white around the edges and most protruding parts. And finally pure black to bring out some of that texture we created with a toothbrush. Wet blending is nothing more than mixing several paints together directly on the surface. It's quite fun and it works perfectly for natural surfaces such as stone, wood, even dirt. Continuing with more small details, I picked out some of the loose straws with the buff color. Plants were painted with different bright greens mixed from, you guessed it, different greens and pure yellow. It's best to play around and not stick to any prescribed formulas because nature offers you endless variations. Except when it comes to German ammo cans. These are coated with field grey highlighted with sunny skin tone. So, details are done, my friends. And now we can proceed with the weathering. Is it weathering when you're painting the groundwork? Well, I think it doesn't matter. It just means enamel paints. This is when we're matching the ground with weathering on the tank, and thus we need to use the same colors. Everything that's not the road is fairly simple. I just applied the dry earth color and the darker damp mud tone in random amounts here and there, and then I mixed them together with enamel thinner. It's a similar wet blending method like with acrylics, but enamels flow much better. Acrylic paints, especially water, have high surface tension and they'd bead up all over the surface. Pre-soaking it with alcohol prior to painting would solve the issue, but spraying it over a model painted with acrylics wouldn't be the brightest idea ever, so enamels or oil paints are the best choice. The road section contains more detail and it needs to correspond with tracks on the tank, so I painted it in a slightly different way. First I added the dry tone over all protruding parts. This means the upper side of the track marks but also any small undulations and mounds of dirt. This was of course blended with enamel thinner, which is gonna make it look more subtle. And then I made this dark, glossy goo from loose ground, which is the main dark color on the ground, and dark wash, which will make it even darker, and also a large amount of wet effects. This Jello of Doom was painted like a heavy wash into every recessed part, and it doesn't need any blending because the still not completely dry first layer will soak it up, creating smooth and random color transitions on its own. We can apply it multiple times over the same section if we want to, and it will give us a more glossy look that's gonna look like puddles. It's quite easy to do it, but I always find this step most difficult because first you need to come up with the idea, right? So on one hand, painting the ground with enamel paints is super easy as a technique, but to me it's also difficult when I need to match the groundwork with the tank. But hey, that's all behind us now, so it's time to glue the tank in place. I used all kinds of tricks in the past. Acrylic mud paste, super glue, but who would think a regular, ordinary, humble PVA glue would do the trick? Maybe everyone except me, but yeah, it works perfectly. A lot of you commented how my figures for this diorama were too clean, and you were completely right. I was keeping this step for later so I could have a clearer idea on what paints to use and how extensive the dirt and grime should be. This will make every miniature painter cringe in pain because I used enamels and oil paints for this task. While sure, it can be done with control using acrylics, I just found using the same enamel paints like on the rest of the project easier, with, more consistent results. I also found good use for oil paints here, not just for adding extra contrast on the muddy bits, but also, and this is so cool, as a weathering tool on the somewhat clean parts like the jacket for example. Not only you can add lots of subtle stains and grime and whatnot, but it also is a quick way to accentuate shadows even further. I should dive deeper into this approach on another figure because the results, while that's spectacular, they still surprised me in a very positive way. And Joe is now gonna feel more welcome or more at home in this muddy landscape. Last but not least, let's quickly go through these accessories. Metal stuff was painted with German grey as a rusty base coat, leaving the brown primer visible here and there, and wooden stuff was sprayed with deck tan. Everything was then coated with chipping fluid and painted in appropriate colors. Field drum with sky, one of the crates with lightened up field grey, and the bucket is gonna be just white. Hairspray chipping is a quick way of adding wear and tear, and it's especially useful if you want some really extensive chipping effects, so it's ideal for these kinds of details. Weathering was carried out with oil paints, and it mostly consisted of pin washes around details, and most importantly rust tones, lots of rust tones. Nothing super involved because every detail requires a certain amount of time to finish properly, and if you get carried away, you can spend several days just painting small stuff and it can easily drive you crazy. The corner would still be quite empty, but at this point I was at the end of my attention span, so the most I was able to come up with were a few planks made from balsa wood. These were painted using the same techniques like wood on the barn, and the same goes for the wooden crate underneath them. Slimy grime is an excellent paint for replicating small concentrations of moss, and it makes for a great addition to any scene in a moderate climate. It can be also used on abandoned vehicles in a forest or somewhere, which is actually something I like to do one day. So the final step as usual is painting the sides in a flat black color. I always prefer this over stained wood or other fancy things because, it's neutral, doesn't distract from the scene, and gives the diorama a sort of tidy and slick look. But, to each their own, it's a completely subjective opinion of mine. Anyway, we're at the finish line, my friends. This was a humongous project which caught me off guard, even though I planned most of it in advance, but now it's done, and if nothing else, it was a massive learning experience. The bigger your diorama is, the more details and features it has, and the more mistakes you start doing, but that's just part of the fun. Imperfections are a sign of human work, and they remind us that there's always room for some improvement. As I said, this is a what if scene because the tank was developed in 1947, but I kinda wanted to put it in Europe as if the war continued after 1945, or maybe the tank was developed faster. It looks like a Pershing on steroids after all, so that was my main reason. So, thank you my friends for watching and for sticking with me throughout this entire thing, even if the tank itself isn't the most popular out there. Now I'm slowly gonna start working on the next project, but before that I'd like to show you a technique or some trick, or both maybe. So that's gonna be on the menu for the next week. In the meantime, thank you again, and thanks to my awesome patrons who make this weekly show possible. There's thousands of photos and posts on my Patreon page which you can access for $5 a month, and it includes frequent, almost daily photo updates from all my projects, all in real time so to say. There are also DMs which you can access for just $1 a month, and also 1 week early ad-free videos and these super nice studio photos which you can download in full resolution, which comes with the highest tier. And there's also 3D models for printing and real-life reference pictures if that's something you'd like to have. Anyway, I'm gonna go now because the weather outside is finally starting to feel like spring and not like Siberian winter. So until the next week, stay safe, stay strong, and keep building models because that stash of yours is not gonna build itself. Yeah, that's it. Cheers!